Good evening everyone. Welcome both to the audience in person here in London and to the very numerous colleagues online. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on Bretton Woods at 80, Reforming Global Economic Governance. Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive here at ODI Global, and I'm really thrilled to have the ability to host this conversation this evening, because this is something that is very dear to many people in ODI Global and to many other colleagues that are grappling with the challenges of whether the multilateral system of today is still fit for purpose. And of course, this year is an important anniversary because it is 80 years of the Bretton Woods institutions. Obviously, they were created after the Second World War with the idea of promoting stability, development, economic cooperation, and they've really become the central pillar of the global economic system. But they operate in a very different world today than the one they were created for. Think about geopolitical shocks, debt crisis, climate stresses really create deep problems for public finances. And of course, widening development gaps. And the fact that all of these pressures are not isolated, but they are concurrent, and in many cases, they are structural. And at the same time, confidence in multilateral institutions is under a lot of strain. And we see many low and middle income countries question whether the Bretton Woods institutions still reflect the economic realities of today. And whether the system as it is gives them sufficient voice, influence, and responsiveness when they need it the most. So the Bretton Woods at 80 report was commissioned to try and interrogate all of these questions. And it really frames the discussion we're going to have tonight. It starts from this reality. It recognizes the continued importance of the IMF and the World Bank, but it also makes clear that the incremental change we've seen, for years may no longer be enough, especially when it comes to governance, to legitimacy, to representation. And it highlights how client countries are navigating a much more complex financing landscape and the frustration that they have around decision-making structures that are highly concentrated, continue to be highly concentrated, despite so many efforts at reform processes that have struggled to translate ambition into real change on the ground. And so what we're witnessing is a lot of not just frustration, but increasingly fragmentation. So the questions for us tonight are really whether the Bretton Woods institutions are still fit for purpose 80 years later, and what meaningful reform would look like in practice, and what should key actors do when the credibility of global economic governance is at stake. And who better to explore this question than this incredible panel that I have tonight, starting to my left, from Minouche Shafik. Baroness Minouche Shafik doesn't need any introduction. She's right now the Chief Economic Advisor to the UK Prime Minister, but she's here tonight not in her capacity as the UK official, but because for many, many years she has held very high-level roles at the IMF and the World Bank, and of course, Bank of England, many leading academic institutions, but can obviously bring deep experience of global economic governance that is important to discussing tonight's challenges. You will have expected Rachel Kite on the panel. Unfortunately, Rachel is unwell, but instead of Rachel, we are incredibly privileged to have with us Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Someone else needs no introduction. Sri Mulyani has been also very senior positions at the IMF as Executive Director from 2002 to 2004, Managing Director of the World Bank, Minister of Development, as well as Minister of Finance of Indonesia. We are so privileged to have you here on the panel. And very importantly, Sri Mulyani is one of the authors of the report, along with Lord Mark Mallow-Brown. Mark, so wonderful to have you back at ODI. Mark, of course, is a trustee of ODI Global, but again, has a career that has been at the heart of so many reform processes in the multilateral system, including, at the World Bank, where he was for many years, and the UN, where he was Deputy Secretary General, and then, of course, trying to make this development system better in all sorts of different ways. And last but not least, we will be joined online by Patrikakis, former Prime Minister of Cote d'Ivoire. He is right now speaking to his president. He will be a touch late, but he will join us in a few minutes as well. Let's get started. We have a lot to cover. Mark, I'll start with you. 80 years on, many clients argue that the World Bank and the IMF no longer reflect the economic realities or the power balances of the time where they were set up. So what do you think is the core problem that we're trying to solve? I mean, is it one of outdated mandates or governance structures that no longer confer legitimacy, or is it the political constraints that are imposed by major shareholders?
Well, certainly lots of all of the above, but I think the place to start in a way is the sort of strange accidental phenomenon that the two institutions in some odd ways are stronger today than they've been in quite a while. And this is perverse because the collapse of ODA when it comes to the World Bank, has, critically put the bank and its lending model of finance even more centrally at the heart of development in an environment where, over an 8-year period up to 2030, we're going to see something like a halving of ODA. The whole ODA structures of bilateral grant-making aid agencies, is really disappearing. It's going to be a very sorry shadow of its former self, able to deal with the poorest countries, able to deal with humanitarian issues, but kind of missing from the financing picture of lower middle and middle income countries. And that, throws a huge responsibility onto the multilateral development banks, because they've kind of inherited, even more than before, the central role, arguably, in development finance. When it comes to the IMF, something different is happening. I mean, like the bank, it enjoys this extraordinary financial structure, a genius of a creation in 1945, whereas both institutions can borrow in the markets highly preferentially. Again, its role is in some ways, quite a high point, because while there are a lot of countries in the world which now look really remiss at getting IMF loans. Countries like Kenya and Nigeria have recently, really pushed back at the prospect of the bad name that an IMF loan in their eyes brings, and their street has pushed even harder. But nevertheless, been very critical in Argentina, is very critical in Ukraine. And as you see more and more threats to the dollar dominance of the global economy, the rise of local trade finance arrangements of cryptocurrencies and a lot else, and as you get more and more geopolitical turbulence, in some ways the IMF as a sort of position of safety, of last resort, if you like, is in a fairly formidable position. And, I would also say that both institutions have currently leaders who've pushed hard to move reform forward. In the case of the bank, they have the evolution roadmap, which, is a managerial success. They've pushed up their lending ceilings. They've done a bit better at partnering with the private sector, etc. But, and this is the big but for both institutions, they are sort of managing incremental reform. They've been thrown to the top of the heap by the tragic collapse of ODA around them. But the world is changing a lot faster than any of that makes up for. You've got a global climate crisis and you've got a global development crisis. And their home is a city where you can no longer talk about climate, and where development has been completely perverted, if you like, from a poverty reduction exercise to one which prioritizes strategic alliances and interests. And, actually just, I think in the last 24 hours, we've seen a citing of the US State Department's 5-year plan for aid and development now that it's reincorporated into the department, and it's a massive cut for Africa and a large increase for Latin America and East Asia. Even though it's not clear what grant assistance is going to do in a country like Chile or Panama, etc. So, I would just, and it's a long answer, but I think in sum, you have to say that these two institutions remain the two last men standing, or women standing, if you like, of the international development finance system, along with the rest of the MDBs, I should quickly add. But they are sort of standing in a war-torn place where a lot of the architecture they relied on has also been torn down. So they have to enter into a period of rapid reinvention at a moment when all the politics of Washington tells them to keep their heads down and not do anything controversial. So the needs of the time are in direct tension with the very little political freedom of maneuver they both currently enjoy.
Well, in the report, and this is a question, both to you and Sri Mulyani, you've argued that the gap between the reform ambition and the lived experience of client countries is widening on governance, on voice, on responsiveness to crisis, on a number of different counts. If you look at the report findings, where do you think we have the greatest disconnect between stated reform commitments and the actual institutional behavior?
Well, in the report, we provide the 3 very important elements. First, on the country ownership, in which the way the 2 institutions, Bretton Woods institution, engage with the client, emphasizing more on the client-owned leadership, ownership, so that they are able to make and push progress. I think coming from my own experience as a client, I was in the management, I was a shareholder, but also a client. Then at the same time, that's really tells a lot about the very important role of the country ownership. You cannot push reform from outside. Even though you are providing financing, you have seen so many evidence that it's not going to work. So that's maybe will create or require a different kind of engagement from the Bretton Woods institution. I think from Ajay, the president of the bank, who tried to regionalize and delegate it to the more regional and closer to the client, that's really the right direction to go. Private sector role is very important. So that's the reform, which I think in terms of the business model, the way they engage with the client is getting there. But from the client own side, I think that will require a lot of work, because you are not talking one homogeneous client in this case. You have fragile state, low income, middle, and even in this case, higher middle income country, which is also a client. The second one is on the financing side. This is more on a capacity. On the IMF side, I think a lot of work which they can engage together with many regional initiatives coming from the Southeast Asia, in which we have the Chiang Mai initiative, that is the regional financial safety net. That is something which can become one of the model. On a second element of this report, which is related to the financial side, I think upscaling without any, the seismic change, what is happening now, there is no, from the shareholder, willingness to actually give more capital. So the 2 institutions have to maximize their own balance sheets, which I think a lot of the recommendation as well as initiative from within is already looking at that one. So the gap is lower. It's more the work with the market, rating agency, and so on. So that is the area which is more manageable within both the leadership as well as the management of the 2 institutions. The third one is on the inclusive governance. I think this is more complicated. Mark has already mentioned very, very lengthy about the governance cannot be separated from the shareholder And the behavior of the shareholder is certainly we are all witnessing today. So I'm not giving any comment, because what we are discussing there is not only about voting right, but how to be more inclusive, and how the voice, especially coming from the middle income country, which actually the main borrower of the institution and generating income, which is actually strengthening their balance sheet, must be and should be recognized more.
Mark, from your perspective?
Well, look, I mean, I think these three corners, of country ownership, finance, and governance are absolutely, the heart of the report, as Sri Mulyani has said. And I think that the just a little further elaboration on the three, and for me, I think I can say this, that one of the most interesting dynamics to watch was Sri Mulyani and our third author, Patrick Achi, who will join us shortly, because, I can say it, you can't because you're too modest, but you did 16 budgets as Indonesian finance minister. I was with her. We were drafting the report during the 16th. That's right? Under 3 presidents, if I've got my count right. And, she grew, and that consistency of policy and the consistency between presidents for a long while of policy allowed Indonesia this long development takeoff. Whereas Patrick will say when he joins us that even though he's an equally long-term minister in Côte d'Ivoire, he had to deal with a civil war between, political elites and groups, the destruction of the wealth of a country which had been, the sort of French legacy in the region. And so this different development experience, led Patrick to be fascinated by the Indonesian example, Chile, where we also went, South Korea, Morocco. And it, I think, left us all, Sri Mulyani from what she'd seen in Indonesia, but the other two of us from the other countries we went, with this absolutely central idea that above all, the bank has to learn some modesty. It can't make up for an absence of a determined government set on successful development. That is the starting point. And if it's missing, it's pushing on a piece of string to make it happen. And, now Côte d'Ivoire is starting to come right. It's had some very good years in the last few years. So, I think one of the lessons is that countries which have really been to the edge often come back and get that consistency and ambition of policy. And so, for the bank, that is a cultural point, because, it is an institution which has been filled with evangelists from the very beginning, who are determined to take the economic philosophies they've imbibed in American and European and British universities and apply it in the country settings they go to as World Bank loan officers. And, instead, recognizing the sort of hybridity of today's intellectual policy environment, that there are lots of different paths to successful development, that not every country needs to adopt the same priorities, but what you want is a country to have priorities and to stick with them. And, I think that is, a lesson which, to be honest, I think the bank has still got a ways to go. It's put the staff in the field, it's getting there. But the idea that the best policy advice may come from, outside of the bank is one they struggle with. And, and ODI and Annalisa does this work on survey of what people think of ODI, of the development banks. And, the bank is way down on policy advice. It's way up as a friendly lender, but it's way down on policy advice. I mean, you can state it more accurately if I've got it wrong, but, and that's because one of the things we realized was, I think when we all began our careers at the World Bank, the World Bank really did have a monopoly of development knowledge. There was a listing, a league table which showed most of the world's best development economists actually worked for the World Bank in terms of, publications, etc. Today, that is not anymore the case, because they work for places like ODI or they're at the table sitting beside Sri Mulyani as her ministerial team, or they're in all the first-class departments of development and economics that we now have around the world, which we didn't at the beginning. So, you know, all of this pushes towards a little bit more humility, please, at the bank. And then just one last point on the financing, but I do think it's an important one. I mean, we push and say, of course, you've got to leverage in private finance. It's the only way to make up for this yawning gap that we see with the departure of ODA. But, you know, we've also got to be realistic about the issues. The ODA pain is felt in the poorest countries. The private sector funds go to the middle income countries. Secondly, you know, the last few years have not been good in terms of private sector net flows into emerging markets. They've been way down. And the different bank instruments to encourage those flows have not worked. And as you heard Sri Mulyani say, things like the credit agency environment have not helped either. And then just finally, you know, we then say, well, we look at the alternative donors. And again, there's this sort of Hail Mary idea that if the OECD countries have given up on development assistance, there's always the Chinese and the Gulf. Well, you know, the Chinese are actually in a situation of sharp net outflows from Africa at the moment. And the Gulf are really important, but it's not yet at a scale to make up for the loss of the sort of Western donors. So, you know, I think there's lots of challenges.
Absolutely. And you mentioned our survey for the audience that may not be familiar. Every 3 years, we run this survey with about 750 senior officials, Ministry of Finance, Treasuries, departments of low and middle income countries that receive either funding. Maybe I'll go to Annalisa when we open to the floor. Annalisa Prizzone, our principal research fellow, that leads on the survey, because that survey is, I mean, I call it the gift that keeps giving, because those data are priceless, and we keep, you know, sort of drawing from the analysis that so many, you know, senior officials all around the world offer of how they see the performance of the World Bank in a number of areas. But Minouche, you have worked both for the IMF and the World Bank. You know these institutions really well. What do you think are the specific challenges that these institutions face today? You know, do you agree with the report and, you know, the specific issues that Mark and Sri Mulyani have set out? Or from you know, someone who has lived these institutions from inside, I would say it differently.
Well, I mean, I think Mark and Sri Mulyani have done an excellent job of describing the challenges that these institutions face. You know, I think they've always been a little bit different, even though they're always referred to as the Bretton Woods twins. I mean, I think for the IMF, I recall, many of you will recall, the IMF had a sort of existential crisis just before the financial crisis, when people said this institution isn't relevant anymore. It's, you know, we should unwind it. And then, of course, inevitably, a financial crisis hit, and it was at the center of everything. And I think at this moment, it's not that kind of existential crisis, because you do have the Argentinas of the world and other countries who are, you know, in real need of IMF support. But I do think this back to basics agenda is resonant with a lot of shareholders, and also, to be frank, with a lot of the staff. And I think that's the main, you know, I don't think the IMF is in jeopardy. I think they will, you know, the role they play in the international system will be needed for a long time, especially when you look around the world at what global debt levels look like. So I think that's the challenge for them. I think for the bank, you know, I mean, I think Mark said it, that their role is even more important in development finance now because of what's happened to ODA budgets. And I think if you look across all of the multilaterals, the report rightly says the multilaterals need to max out their balance sheets. And if you did that really well, you could generate 500 billion of additional lending, which is certainly needed. But the mirror image of that potential increase in development finance is debt. And the constraint is the fact that even though the financing is there, countries can't afford to take on more debt. And so, I think that is the crux of the challenge for the multilateral development banks, is how, if they are going to be the main source of development finance, how are we going to solve the debt problem in order to make that possible?
Absolutely. I just want to check if Patrick has joined us. Looking at my team over there, not yet. Okay, so I'll carry on with Minush. I mean, we've talked about the challenges with reforming. There's been a lot of efforts to reform these institutions. And there is this feeling there is a bit of resistance to reform. I mean, the report, and I'll ask Patrick when he joins us, something that the report really tackles is this incrementalism, this, I call it tinkering at the side, a little bit of technocratic, reform that doesn't really tackle, the critical issues. Do you think this could actually accelerate fragmentation? I mean, we see that countries are turning to alternative institutions outside the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah. I mean, I think the development finance architecture has been fragmenting now for a couple of decades, and that trend is continuing. I remember the monopoly days when all of us were kids at the World Bank and the IMF, where these institutions really did have a monopoly on development knowledge and development finance. It was a very different era. I still remember the first time being in a meeting with someone who you will remember, who was a vice president of the World Bank, who raised the extraordinary idea that, maybe McKinsey might be a competitor to us one day. And that was considered impossible. No way. No one would trust a bunch of management consultants to give them policy advice. And, look at the world today. So yeah, it's a very, very different world, and it is a much more fragmented world. And I personally think it's fantastic that developing countries have so many sources of advice in their own countries, around the world. I think on the knowledge and policy advice side, it's a great thing that there's a diversity of views and debates and alternatives to look at. On the financing side, I think the fragmentation is more of a problem. Some of you will be old enough to remember the Paris harmonization agenda, when donors were meant to try and consolidate, to try and reduce the complexity for recipients, and the horror stories about having to fill out umpteen forms for 50 donors in different. And it's in the pandemic they are converging. They converge, do you think? So yes. I think that has got, but the risk is of fragmentation is that will get worse again. But say something about the pandemic, Shri.
No, well, that's life-threatening, and then all the multilateral institutions then get together to how to rescue or to help the client. And that's why they actually can join. And even like AIIB, which is headquartered in Beijing, which actually from the very beginning only engaged with the project financing. During the pandemic, they even convert into a program financing. This is related to how to help people on a social safety net, expanding the social safety net, on the health issue. So it's actually quite amazing what I see as a client at that time during the pandemic, that all line up. We have the Asian Development Bank, of course, the World Bank, and then we have the AIIB, Islamic Development Bank. They are all with one. And now I think they are getting better with even the one uniform procurement. I think that's really quite a progress in a way for the client point of view.
But let's address the elephant in the room. The most influential actor in the Bretton Woods institution remains the US, the United States. Voting power, agenda setting capacity, you can't ignore the weight of the United States. To what extent is meaningful reform possible without US leadership? And what are the strategies if the US doesn't align with calls for deeper focus on key agendas like climate change?
Well, I think it's limited, but not entirely absent, the room for reform. And And the reason I say that is this back to basics agenda, which makes a lot of people cringe. But you're right. I mean, actually, genuinely was appreciated when Scott Bessent announced it at the spring meetings last year. A lot of governments said, particularly African governments said, thank God, we're going to no longer have these fussy Europeans imposing all of their development priorities on us. We are going to be able to choose our priorities. And, it was much better received than the Europeans in the room wanted it to be. Let me put it that way. And now there's this strange thing that the administration has done such a good job of trashing and destroying its own aid delivery system, USAID, that it's sort of forced back perversely onto the World Bank as its sort of development agent. The real risk of that is that far from the US then weakening its control over the institutions, it actually increases it. And, I think we were both slightly taken aback at Scott Bessent's sort of implied message, which was, look, you can deal with me. I'm a financial guy. If I can say to, I mean, this is not what he said, but this was the sort of body language of his communications to people at that meeting. It was, Trump listens to MAGA. They want to close this institution down, or at least withdraw the US from it. The alternative to that is to let me be able to tell Donald Trump the World Bank does our business. So there's a strange sort of reverse of the UN's problem. The UN's problem is that the US completely pulls out, kicks it out of New York, and it becomes, really struggles to survive. The bank's problem is that it becomes smothered by the US because it is such an important economic instrument. And I'm looking, as I say this, to my dear friend and colleague who worked on this report, Stephen Paduano, who came from the US Treasury to help us do this, and is constantly cautioning me to control my sort of alarm about the US on this. But I think the reason it is so worrying is that if you look at the longer term, the health of both institutions, bank and fund, depends on loosening their US ties, that the US needs to lose, an effective sort of veto power in the two institutions, because that is the road back to legitimacy, a resetting of the ownership. What we try to argue in this report is, that will mean that a lot of countries, developing countries, get a bigger stake. In truth, the main haircut needs to be taken by the Europeans. As a proportion of the global economy, they are much more overrepresented than the US, including Britain, of course. But, and so China would go up, Brazil and India would go up, etc. But our argument in the report is if you get this country ownership thing right, then this formal governance becomes much less important. If you don't, then there is a real risk that it becomes a sort of tug of war between the US and the rest, and it becomes hugely destructive. So in a way, what you've got to do is steer the Scott Bessents into believing, if you believe in back to basics, then let an African country choose its own development priorities and back them when they do it. And it'll be a diplomatic pirouette to get there. In the meantime, you have the risk that the US will continue to push resources towards its foreign policy priorities. So 33% approximately of the IMF's current outlays, I think, are Argentina. Both institutions are overexposed in Ukraine, important issue though it is. Ajay Banga, the president of the bank, has been appointed to Trump's Board of Peace, and I'm sure is going to have his pockets robbed in terms of Gaza reconstruction, which are all very important tasks. But when the biggest civil war in the world is in Sudan, you've got to keep a sense of global priority and balance. And, you know, that requires this resetting of ownership.
Completely agreed. In reality, though, the struggle to reform meaningfully precedes this moment of paralysis, you know, that the US may have created. You know, there are those that argue that the system has always evolved gradually, that you can't really rock the boat too much, that, you know, you can't change too dramatically because this could destabilize the institutions. And that's something that you really tackle well in the report. I mean, we've seen for years, for decades, reform debates that produce communiques, reviews, incremental adjustments. You know, this gradualism that is really irritated and frustrated clients. So what would a meaningful reform look like in practice? You know, what are the changes that really most tangibly countries could see? I mean, particularly on this topic of, you know, country ownership. This is something that's been debated for a long time. This is a question to all three. You can all, you know, have your preferred, you know, entry point to see meaningful reform.
Back to what Minus mentioned earlier, I mean, the engagement between this Bretton Woods institution and the client is actually on the knowledge, the financing, and of course, the business model, which is dictated by their governance. And on the knowledge, I think with the AI now, on McKinsey and all those things, many of even my former staff in the Ministry of Finance, I think they can really like discuss in the same level with many.
I think you told me once that you discovered one of your staff was preparing your briefings with ChatGPT.
It's actually quite impressive in a way. So the knowledge is going to be one which is quite threatened by all this digital technology development. On the financing side, I mean, the client constraint because of their fiscal room and debt exposure is becoming one of the most important. So the question, we have in the past, the haircut, which is again, the United States initiated that for many of the low-income country. So what is going to be today? I mean, we have the debt restructuring, which in the past, I think 5-10 years is more on how much or how big the exposure coming from China debt vis-a-vis the non-China debt in this case. And that's why the debt transparency data and so on. But this is only the mechanic. But the real question, how the country have still the ability to actually sustain those debt, and they don't have it. The important element for those is actually domestic resource mobilization, so reform within the country. And that is really maybe the focus of these two institutions combined with the other multilateral, how you are going to be able to make really a meaningful reform within the country so that their own governance, their ability to collect tax, as well as actually manage their public finance better. I think that's very important. So on that area, I think the United States is going to be happy if the client is going to be better and the Bretton Woods institution. So I think there are still quite a lot of room for those institutions to actually work beside the main shareholder, like United States, still in their own situation in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there are a set of reforms that would be relatively uncontroversial in terms of the shareholders, like more country ownership, more decentralization and location in client countries, increasing efficiency and speed. I think every client complains that too slow, takes too long. So those kind of reforms, more risk appetite, more willingness to stretch the balance sheet a bit further. I think everybody would support that. So I do think one could carve out a set of reforms which would improve the performance of these institutions, which could, could be done quickly, actually, if there was enough energy behind them.
The evolution roadmap, which is the sort of reform thing that came out of the G20 process at the bank, genuinely is moving. I mean, they really are improving their game and, simplifying things, as Srimulyani said, doing much better in terms of partnerships with other development institutions. So I think, that there is a lot moving. It's just, the scale of the emerging challenges, and is it, it's a too little too late but possible problem, which I think they struggle with. And here, I think the key thing is to start thinking of the multilateral development bank system as a system rather than just the World Bank as the flagship and the others as the also-ran. Because, actually, in Latin America, the IADB or the CAF are at least as significant players as the bank. Increasingly in East Asia, I would think the AIIB, is a major player, and obviously the Asian Development Bank, as well. And then you've got then you've got the national development banks. Brazil's national development bank is huge. It's bigger than the World Bank. And so, one of the things the World Bank could do is help that network of national development banks access the international capital markets and start to build this real sort of ecosystem of institutions which co-finance with each other, which respect each other's lead on different geographies or sectors, and which then collectively become a conduit for private finance to enter in. Because I think we've not talked about it much today, but I think one of the problems, if you're Indonesia, you're big enough that the private funders, the banks, private equity houses, they come and take a look for themselves. They'll have people on the ground. The difficulty in a smaller African country or smaller country anywhere is that the transaction costs of importing a team to do what is then just a small project doesn't work. So this issue of trying to bundle loans in a way that they are originated by these MDBs, but then bundled into a way that can be securitized and sold on to private investors. It may be much more instruments like that than direct project investment, which start to scale up the volume of private finance. So we'll see. But I mean, I think it's a time when they certainly need to innovate, because, if they just are left within their current resource envelope, the needs are going to be overwhelming. So they've got to find a way to be, in the phrase of an earlier report, not ours, bigger and better.
Absolutely. And we haven't talked about, the particular challenge that they have to operate in countries so-called, fragile and conflict affected, where we continue to see a real problem, for these institutions. So maybe we'll come back to that. But Patrick has now joined us online, so let's welcome him. Thank you so much, Patrick, for
You're very welcome.
So we were just discussing this issue of sort of bolder reform versus this very gradual, incremental, tinkering at the edges that we've seen over many years. And I have asked all of your colleagues, and we have Srimulyani with us as well, which is a very welcome surprise. We've got all the 3 report authors, which is brilliant, for their perspective about where reform should be, sharper, can go farther, can really finally transform these institutions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly? Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you to Mark and Srimulyani, who've been really saying exactly, our views. We're really happy moving all around the world to listen to the developing countries and also inside the World Bank to be able to hear the perspective of the lenders. As far as the continent is concerned, Africa is concerned, as you know, we've had quite slow growth compared to countries like Southeast Asia or Latin America, like 60 years back, where, quite close to a lot of, African countries. You can see today that these countries have been able to leapfrog. 80% of the countries in Southeast Asia are developed developing countries, and the same thing almost in Latin America. Yet Africa is still lagging, and it's a real concern, and I would see it's even an emergency concern. And the World Bank and the IMF, as Mark, Marlon Brown, Sue Mullaney, and myself, to try to see 25 years down the line what the world will be and how should this institution reform to be able to meet the demand of the client at that time. For the continent, as you know, the whole African continent represents 3% of world GDP, less than 3 or 4% of the world trade. Poverty rate was 10% by 1990 in the continent. It will be 60% of all poor in the world in 1930 and in 2030. And if nothing is done, by 2025, it will be 90% of the world poor that will be in the continent. Now, as you know, and we all know it, reducing poverty is creating jobs. It's the best way to create sustainable jobs and reduce poverty for a long time. Creating jobs means developing the private sector. Developing the private sector is attracting, private investors, and attracting the private investors is creating an environment that is conducive for them to come, meaning developing the infrastructure. Developing the infrastructure is the role of the state, meaning raising enough funds to develop the infrastructure. But now, if you are indebted or you have a hard time accessing resources, then you might be really in trouble. And that's the situation now today. Most of the half of the countries in the continent are, indebted. And we know that the population is going to double by 2025. And all these people that will represent 1/4 of the whole world, and like most of them will be youth, 70% out of them will be less than 35 years old, need really to get out of poverty. And the World Bank and IMF are these institutions that have been created to accompany this country and this continent out of poverty. Now, why 60 years down the line, I'm saying, are we still lagging? Are the right things being done? Is the organization well structured and mobilizing enough resources to help the country get out of that? The feeling is that there is a lot more to do, mainly if by 2025 we want to meet the challenges of poverty reduction and sustainable growth and development for these countries. And what we've seen out of that, and the World Bank has already started to do some of it, on the operation side, speed up operation. Taking 2 years or 3 years for instruction of a project would be really too long, to sustain, for the country. You have to be much closer to the client. I think the World Bank has started. Maybe we should move more instead of just sitting all of you in DC, maybe being more and close to the client to be able to answer quickly their need, but also to listen and to feel what is really going on. A better organization, I think that's a very important issue the World Bank has started. You cannot today separate the private sector and the public sector. The private window, we'll say, and the public window. Both of them have to work together. I think they have started organizing themselves with the IDA, IBRD, and IFC, and as well the IDA guarantee, all of them getting together, as one, component to be able to meet the need. I think it's the right direction. More needs to be done on that direction. The debt issue is also something that we should be really working at. I would say maybe the IMF might be more concerned about that, which is get people out of the crisis, debt crisis when they are in crisis is one thing. Helping them being able to stay long enough out of the debt burden is something that maybe needs to be looked out much closely. Because today we're waiting for the country to be really in a very deep crisis to come and help them get out the shore. Now, what is the long-term perspective? It's supposed to be the World Bank helping, doing that. And I think there need to be a more deeper collaboration between the World Bank and the IMF, both of them working, with the country. And that brings us to the issue of ownership. and the issue of partnership. We want a partnership, not a paternalist, position, which means really the countries have their will, they know what they want to do, but the bank is the knowledge bank. They know what is being done out of the world, everywhere. They have the knowledge, so they should work hand to hand with these, client countries to be able to move forward. Because at the end of the day, the World Bank, whatever they will do, will never be able to meet just by themselves the need of the financing that the country have. So they should have the country get to the resources that are out there in the market and also with the other financial institution and attract the private sector in order to really invest, create growth, generate jobs, generate revenue that will sustain the debt. So, being around of that, and I think we've worked on that. They are going toward that direction, but, some deeper issue, should be addressed and go much, much, much further down. The staff will be an issue because when you have decided to reorganize, when you have decided to transform, when you have decided to change the procedures, now you don't change human behavior as fast as your organization is changing. And you will realize that you need another type of behavior, another type of knowledge, another type of people to be able to implement the organization change that you have put forward. So one of the highest, and the challenging thing will be in the next 10 to 25 years, how the bank and the IMF is going to change, to improve, to train the staff for them to be able to match the new organization that is needed for this country by then.
Brilliant. It could be clearer, really. I won't open to the audience, but let me just ask you one final question. You made a very cogent case for the importance for these institutions to create true partnerships and move from this paternalistic stance. And this is something that we hear more and more in a very vocal way from low and middle income countries and African countries in particular. How can these countries come together in stronger coalitions that can really be more forceful and leverage this call for change?
I think that through, for instance, as far as Africa is concerned, through the African Union, I think that Latin America also have regional organization to do that. We have quite a lot of organizations that are voicing out the issue of being more represented in the shareholders or in this big institution to be heard. Because what I just told you looks very simple, but sometimes we feel that they don't have the voice to voice it out. Today, everybody agree, and I think that the World Bank has put in the core as a core issue of now its project job creation. Now, job creation, as I told you, is private sector development. Today, only 4% of FDI goes to the African continent, where 43% of FDI go to Asia and 18% to Latin America. Now, there's no way you will be able to create the job you want to create if the private sector doesn't come. And maybe it's only 4% of total FDI of the world that go to 54 countries. You're not going to make it. Now, that has to be heard, and that has to be heard somewhere. It's on the boards, on meetings, on where people are gathering to make decisions. So, yes, we want to be heard, not that, we want to disrespect, or we do not consider that, even being more powerful mean bringing in more money, but we think that we should be given a window of opportunity to make people understand how the situation is emergent, how if we don't do anything about things like climate in the country or development or job creation, it's going to be a threat to Europe, to the US, for the whole world. Today, the issue that developing country and some poor country are facing, people think that it's far away. But COVID has told us that what you think is far, the next day can be just on your front door. So when we're asking to be heard at a higher level, we do not want to change the whole thing. We just say, look, now the world is just a big village. Anything happening anywhere can be a threat for anybody anywhere. So giving more attention to this developing country, give them room, listening to them on the board of these different institutions will definitely help the cause of all of us. And we think that not enough room is given. Now, the situation actually is not really easy to advocate for that. But as I say, once again, it's a way forward. This multilateralism, that which is, disappearing, unfortunately, we should be in a situation to make, a wake-up call to tell people, you forget very easily that we are on the same planet. And, the climate is not an issue of one country in the US or in Europe. Anything happening anywhere is going to get us back. So we are not really sufficiently well organized to voice out all these messages. And I think that the institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, who are already organized to be in having country offices in all these places, could be a vector of conveying these messages to their board, even if we do not have the weight there to be heard. And I think their role is important. And if we're asking these changes to be made into this institution, it's not that they are not relevant. It's not that they are not important today or for the future. It's just that the world is moving much faster than they are able to organize and change themselves to adapt to this world. And with AI, it's going to move much faster. So they really have to adapt. It's a matter of survival, not only for them, but for the whole, financial architecture system, as well as the developing and the developed world.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think the case for change was made very, very clearly. And if I can bring something for a conversation we hosted last week on the reform of the UN Charter, we had the colleagues on the panel were making very clear that when the Charter was signed, only 51 countries were independent. Today's 193. It was a very different world. The institutions that were created 80 years ago, the governance of those institutions is absolutely no longer fit for purpose. So reform couldn't be more urgent. Let me open to the audience first here in the room and then online. Maybe I'll come in a second. Maybe I'll just ask Annalisa first to give us a tiny, very brief summary of what is emerged from the survey that's just been completed. It's not been published yet, so you can get some quick preview.
So first of all, fantastic discussion. Actually, we started a few years ago with a survey of client countries of MDBs, actually because there was limited kind of voice and representation within the institutions. So still, we need to remind ourselves that in 2 African constituencies at the World Bank, they represent more than 20 countries. So having their voice at the board represented might be a real challenge. So we already have some early results of the client survey online. Of course, it's not only about the World Bank, but also about other 10 MDBs, and we're going to publish at the end of March. But just a couple of highlights and partly resonate with the conversation. First of all, MDBs are still extremely relevant institutions for their own clients. And actually, since the first edition, their relevance has gone up, and it resonates actually with the fact that ODA is shrinking and the role of MDBs is going up. Certainly, as I said, they're relevant and also they're considered effective in the different functions they're offered. But there is one function, again, it resonates with what was mentioned earlier on, knowledge, research. That's probably the function of the MDBs that's kind of less valued. And in the conversations, not only this time we had the client survey, but myself and Fatum actually traveled to a few countries. So we heard directly from government officials in client countries and across the spectrum. Actually, they want to see knowledge much more kind of tailored to the needs of their own country. They want to see the expertise recognized. I mean, they have expertise and they want to see the knowledge somehow reflective of the context where they operate. So this is certainly a kind of a key priority. Also, the effectiveness of MDBs is very different across the institutions. And again, we spoke very clearly around decentralization, country presence, working with government officials to define the priorities and supporting them was clearly associated with their own kind of relevance. But again, watch this space. End of March, we'll have the full survey online.
Back to the questions. Gentleman here, and I'll come in the back as well.
Hi, hello.
So let's see how many we can fit in. Please introduce yourself and say if you are affiliated to any organization.
Yes, I mean, my name is Arif Azad. I am in public health, consultant. I have worked in international organizations. Yes, with MSF and others. And yes, I mean, thank you very much for your, presentation. Yes, I mean, my question is, the going forward, because I have witnessed there is tensions between IMF and, the World Bank aims, because when IMF hands out a loan, it has the social and political costs in terms of the consequences, and then the World Bank is there to take up the social costs of that experiment, but that again is resolved through lending, not the aid or the grants which can overcome the social and political costs of the IMF debts. So I think that is the issue. And yes, could you kindly, comment on that? And my second question is about IMF, the formulas. Have they changed over the years? Because to me, one size fits all is being implemented over the last 80 years. And is the country specificities, political systems or social systems are taken into account, or just one formula?
Thank you very much. I've got a few here. I'll come back to you. Ed at the back there.
Ed Davey, WRI. Thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic. One question for Manoush and others on the debt crisis. What is the answer to the problem, Manoush, that you set out there about debt? And then the second question is, could one of you venture to give the best case scenario for the next 2 years here in terms of how a group of countries could come together to lead good reform in the next 2 years? Thanks.
Gentlemen here, I'm looking for the women. There's a lot of gentlemen with hands up.
Tony Addison from UN Wider in Helsinki. Country ownership, we're all agreed that it's very desirable, but there are some tensions, and perhaps the panel could talk about that, particularly in times of financial distress, when the macroeconomic sums are not adding up. And the IMF in particular is the bearer of bad news. But then the second tension is, and this is the other question, which is when a country says, we're a very poor developing country, our only source of real foreign investment is oil, gas, and mining, say in the case of Mozambique, which has had the largest gas investment in Africa, one of the largest foreign direct investments in Africa. And we don't feel we're getting much support from the World Bank or the IMF in that, perhaps because of the worried Europeans. I'm a worried European. So that's the sort of second question. So country ownership, very nice, but tensions, macroeconomics, times of distress, it tends to get thrown overboard. Secondly, what if the country says, we've got a great project here, but it's in oil, gas, and mining?
Excellent. There's a lady at the back who is very keen to come in.
Thank you. My name is Funke Barua, and I'm a gender and development analyst. I would like to ask a question. Not sure who would answer that, but I'm just curious. It's been 80 years of Bretton Woods, and it's been 80 years or more, maybe for development assistance, I'm not sure. But just a question around how have the institutions been incentivizing borrowing countries to sort of develop from inside out. I work on gender and social inclusion, and I know one of the goals is to make sure that those who we give maybe conditional cash transfers and grants to can sort of come out of poverty after a certain number of years. And some of the programs I've worked on even have had exit strategies of 2 to 5 years, for support. What is the model for Bretton Woods to ensure that countries who borrow and have borrowed for decades, I'm sure some even for 80 years, can, withdraw from these systems? And I like what Patrick said about partnerships rather than, I'd like to use the word patriarchy, but how do we ensure that we can win borrowing countries from loans? Thank you.
Let me just get a couple more. I've got loads online as well, so I'll have to do another round. You've been asking for the beginning, and Dirk as well. I'll take this too, and the gentleman here, and I'll come to you as well.
Oh, cheers, thanks. Yeah, my name's John Gibb. I used to work in development, but I'm just a pensioner now. So
That's nice.
I have to say, I'm a bit concerned about the relaxed way that the conversation has gone. There doesn't seem to be any push, any concern. I can't see the link with all the stuff that I have to see on television these days and listen to on the World Service when I can't sleep at night. And I don't quite understand. You seem to be still pushing this reform agenda and reforming global economic governance. Why economic governance? What about governance? What has been missing since 1944 and the setting up of the fund and the bank and the others is that there's been no lead on good governance, because I guess at the time it wasn't seen to be important because they were all colonies anyway, and there was no need, there was no demand for this. So there's been a great big gap ever since independence started to come about from say 1947. So to a great degree, I feel we've wasted 80 years, and things are getting pretty desperate. And as others more eloquent than me have pointed out, there's a shortage of funding, there's still plenty of debt, but in the meantime, of course, how many people will have died in Sudan while we've been sitting here? I mean, it's just atrocious.
Thanks.
And there are ways to address this. In fact, Mark, when you started, you were doing a great opening statement, but it just occurred to me how is governance now dealt with, say, within the bank and the fund? They're not simply economic institutions, stacked with good economists.
I think the question is clear.
There's a big gap there.
Thanks. Dirk, Willem, and the gentleman here, and then we'll have to come back to the panel, otherwise I can't take the online question. But clearly there's a lot of interest and a lot of thirst for further debate.
Thank you so much. I was very interested to hear about the sort of the mood swings of the Bretton Woods institutions. When I joined ODI in 2000, we just had Tony Killick putting the final nail in the coffin of structural adjustment. So really real critique of the Bretton Woods institutions. About a decade later, I was chairing some sessions that sort of were talking about the IMF was surplus to requirements almost, because we had a stable period just before the financial crisis, and we didn't need the IMF anymore. And now, of course, countries are queuing up and still have been queuing up for some time. So I'm wondering where it's going to go into the future. But I think we also need to question sort of the role of finance versus policies here. And I think that's brought up by the survey and by Lord Malloch Brown. And that's based on the experience that I've got at the moment working on Sri Lanka. It's going through its 17th IMF program. And just like Pakistan and other programs in the region, but also probably in African countries, it's been probably successful in using the IMF programs to stabilize the economy in year 1 and 2 of the programs. But in year 3, they veer off and do other things and so on. And then they need to go back to the IMF, back to the other funders because they haven't really sorted out the economy. And so job creation, industrial development, economic transformation, productivity change, diversification, all those issues need to happen in order to make it more diversified and not go back to an IMF. So I'm wondering what can be done to really change the knowledge function so that it's really useful for countries to sort of absorb any of the knowledge and to and hopefully they're willing to change the policies in order to grow and not needing the finance anymore. And I think if we go back, and that's the last point, back into sort of the development, I don't think that finance is the main or the only reasons behind development. It's policies, institutions, and that's where I think the Bretton Woods institutions need to really think more fundamentally. Just to echo Patrick, I think he was arguing it as well.
I want to bring in the gentleman who's been waiting patiently, and then I'll think what I'll do is just take a couple from the online questions, and we'll do just one round because there won't be a chance to do another one.
Thank you. My name is Servine Mansour Guy. I head the Senegal UK Chamber of Commerce, but also trade and investment in sustainability, so banking. My question is pretty much probably you're gonna know Senegal and IMF. Currently, there is they had a misreporting from the previous Senegalese government, and the new government came in and they said, "Listen, there is a misreporting." But till now, the IMF is currently not probably, you know the question already, probably. But what advice is it there? How should the IMF reform its governance to balance sustainability, sovereignty, and development in Africa? Because it's pretty much important. Until now, the Senegalese government is still waiting. And actually, we have to go around the world to seek for funding. And when a new government came in and they decided to come clean and say, listen, there's misreporting, I'm not going to call it hidden debt, but should the IMF be there and help them and actually release the funding for the project we have in the country? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let me just take a couple. There's so many online. I'll pick two. Staru Gori from Mouvement pour la Liberté Individuelle in Burundi asks concretely, what must change in IFIs, DFI mandates, and global financial rules so that perceived risk does not continue to outweigh demonstrated local capacity to deliver jobs? And then Saida from the IMF in DC says, hi, Saida here from the IMF. I wanted to ask how we can help countries incentivize the dismantling of the patriarchal status quo between the institutions and the clients beyond asking for a broadening of the knowledge and the financial sector base. Take a couple of each. I don't know, you want to start? Patrick as well? There was one specific question to you around that. Yeah, maybe we'll start there and say,
exactly.
Yes.
I'll take that. And the question on, graduation. Do countries ever, grow out of these institutions? So on debt, I think it's quite clear that the Paris Club structure doesn't work anymore. There was something called the Common Framework, which was proposed as an alternative to try and get resolution. It took Zambia, I think, a couple of years to go through any kind of process. There is no functional debt restructuring mechanism in the world today. I think that's a fair statement. And of course, there is the issue about China and the fact that it doesn't participate in some of these existing, although they were observers, I think, in the Paris Club and the Common Framework. So it is a bit of an intractable problem. I mean, my personal view is that we might need multiple fora to resolve debt issues. that the idea that it's all going to be done in one agreed forum might not be the right strategy. And that, the debt that many countries have vis-a-vis China might be better resolved through a process with, directly, rather than trying to work through a multilateral process, because the current multilateral process is just too slow and countries suffer for a very, very long time. And yes, the question is, does it ever end? I think you are referring to the use of cash transfers and the fact that you design programs so that people graduate. And I think Mark and I know an organization called BRAC, which is very good at just precisely those kinds of programs which lift people out of poverty in a permanent way. And the question is, do these institutions, do they do the same? And to be fair, a lot of countries do graduate. One forgets the first World Bank loan, I recall, was to France. They've certainly graduated.
On their way back.
Fair point. But if you look at countries like Korea, many East Asian countries have now graduated. Chile, there are many countries in Latin America. So countries do graduate from borrowing. And that's a really good thing and to be celebrated.
Morocco prides itself to be a lender to IDA now.
Exactly. And Indonesia, I believe, was a contributor to the last IDA round as well. So not only do they graduate, but they become donors to the institution. So those are the big success stories. And we shouldn't be too pessimistic. We have lived, the last 50 years has seen the fastest reduction in poverty in human history. If you look at most of the social indicators, what's really interesting is how normally income and social indicators move together. Well, social indicators have improved faster than incomes in recent decades. Now, the last couple of years have been bad for all, and I think the facts show that. But development has worked in the last 50 years, and we shouldn't be too, we shouldn't let current challenges undermine that fundamental truth. Countries do graduate, development finance does improve their lot. And many of them are successful, just not enough.
Wait,
I'll take this one. I remember that within the bank, there is a discussion regarding the great convergence, meaning that low income, middle income growing faster so that they are going to converge with a high income country. That was like less than 10 years ago. So all this good story about poverty reduction, some inclusivity, gender, governance, even in this case, I think they are also addressing in many of the country. What I'm going to say is that many of these require their own country ownership and leadership. You cannot impose governance from outside. I mean, Indonesia have the financial crisis that make the debt increase dramatically because of the banking bailout back in 97, 98. And then we have to be under the IMF program, very painful, of course. But then we are actually moving forward. And that was because we're addressing quite a lot of huge, more than 500 legislation being passed within only like 2 years. Then the question regarding the ownership, it was imposing under the IMF program, but then there is a strong ownership within the country because of the democratization, decentralization, and many of the reform, both on a financial as well as on a structural one. So that made, even when Mark mentioned that I serve as a finance minister, it was a quite very tight reform as well as tightening belt for the public finance. But then we actually enjoy quite a lot of this question regarding a country who has the mining and gas. Indonesia also have a mining and gas. And we enjoy when the commodity boom to actually use this boom to then create from stability into growth. I think all countries have their own resources or have the possibility to actually push this reform forward. And the role of both, whether you are under the IMF program or using the World Bank and other multilateral institutions to work with you. Once you have the leadership, actually you can ask them to do what you want. And that is exactly what I enjoy as a client. I'm the boss. I'm the one who know, I know what I ask. Of course, they say that, oh, of course, Sri Mulyani knows about our kitchen. That's why he knows what kind of food that he's asking. But that is exactly very important. I mean, the knowledge regarding and the trust and respect, confidence is very important. This is not just the ownership in which I want to do whatever I want, and then you just give me money. That won't work also in a way. So the ownership is actually a mutual respect and trust that need to be built based on a track record. And of course, you have to be very honest regarding what is the difficulty, the trade-off, the choices, the political sensitivity, which I think then technocratically, when we communicate with the World Bank or the IMF, they can understand. And they usually, when they see it, that is really something which is objectively there, they are going to provide a space. But I'm not saying that Indonesia is a special case in a way. I mean, this is also something which is actually enjoyed by many countries which didn't have the success story in a way that they are not going back to the, like Sri Lanka and other, going back to the IMF program every 3 years. So I think a lot of what you're asking, I also agree with Minus that a lot of achievement, we should not feel that as if nothing happened in the past 20 years. Of course, current situation is very fluid and very uncertain, but it should not make us totally disoriented. There are a lot of good principle, good achievement that actually can become one of the asset, a truly asset for us to rebuild what we need to build during this, what you call it, the rupture or whatever the situation that we are having. So it should come from that. And I think many countries aware about that kind of willing, the coalition of willing among good intention. And we should also exclude the United States because they are actually still very, very important shareholder and very important player in the world. So the communication and this building coalition is still very, very important under this current situation.
Great. Let me go to Patrick. Actually, last week on the panel on the UN reform, Ambassador Patriota was talking about the coalition of the responsible. It's like, let's not talk about the willing, but those who really feel this global responsibility. Patrick, there were many other questions around, the knowledge function, around, the tendency for the IMF to be one size fits all, around, the wider governance topic. Any that you'd like to address that hasn't been addressed so far, or if you want to add to what colleagues have already answered. Can you hear us, Patrick?
Yes. I would like to address maybe one of the key points here, which is governance. I think that it's very important to insist because, as I was saying, yet we're talking about BW at 80, but it doesn't mean that the World Bank is responsible of all the wrong or bad doing happening in the world, because the responsibility of the World Bank is not to develop all the countries. The countries have the responsibility to develop themselves. Yet the World Bank and the IMF come to help, because sometimes people, you give them the opportunity to find excuse on their own responsibility that they do not really hold. World Bank didn't develop China. China lifted out of poverty 800 million people in 40 years. They might have helped in knowledge, but it's not the World Bank finance either that changed, It's not the World Bank and IMF that changed South Korea or Vietnam or Chile. So the issue is that the World Bank, as you say, cannot develop a country, if the country itself doesn't really have the will, and that's the issue of the partnership. The partnership, at the end of the day, and that's the specific issue of the World Bank is not a bank there to bring money or doing transaction. It's a development bank, meaning it's there to accompany the country who have the will to develop. Now, having the will to develop and being able to share with the World Bank is for the World Bank to be able to tell
the truth to everyone. And that's the other issue. When you come to the country and you realize that there's a governance issue, which means beside even the World Bank or the IMF money, they are not able to use their own money to be invested in an efficient way. But you don't say anything. You accompany in the wrong sense. That is not the same thing as putting conditionalities, but work out together a program that is a sound program. When you see a program that cannot develop that country, your knowledge should bring you to tell this country, we feel this is the way forward. Now, if they don't want to go that way, you don't have to find excuses all the time because the World Bank, even if there are changes to be made in both these institutions, let's not hide the changes that have to be made in the countries that are not behaving properly. And I guess one of the biggest change that will allow the World Bank and the IMF to be more efficient, not have the IMF coming every 5 years or every 10 years to get the country out of the crisis, is really governance. And to me, this is not addressed sufficiently. People are talking around, they don't dare talking to leaders that you need vision, you need leadership, you need governance, then money can change something. Money is not the issue. People are trying to think that scale up finance. As long as you don't have the basics of governance and the sound program, more money will just give you more debt and sink you much faster. And we can say, and we say sometimes, that the World Bank close eyes and the IMF on things that they should not. They keep lending, knowing that these countries are sinking, to the extent where the IMF come, get them on the shore, and then we start again lending and doing the wrong thing. So the governance issue, I think, and that's where the partnerships comes. Being able to tell very frankly to your friends, to your country borrowers that, look, we will not be able to move that way anymore. We better go and lend money to someone who has a good governance, who have proof of result. It will be better than just keep giving money to people that you can see obviously cannot use it properly. My country went through many years of crisis, and since 2011, we've been getting 7% growth steadily for the past 15 years. Trying to do better governance, we need to do more. But I guess when you don't start on that things, and it doesn't work. And very often the institution and international institution do not dare say what people do not want to hear. And I want to be more balanced on this issue of BWIT and say, look, yes, the World Bank has so many change and to move forward, but yet the country who are still behind also need to dig more inside, which are the core causes of being or lagging, and really tackle them. Then together they can really move forward. I really want to say to really pinpoint this governance issue, because I think it's at the heart of a lot of things.
Brilliant. Mark, any final reflections?
Final thoughts, and I should just say for those of you who want to read the report, bwi80.org. And on its first page, you'll find a quote: "The old order is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters," which is Gramsci. And, reason we put it there, and I have to say some of the IMF staff particularly were a little dismayed we had put it there because it didn't seem to fit with the tone was because all over the world, as we ran the consultations for this report, people spontaneously raised this quote with us. There is this sense of a ruptured system of something new to come. And so to the extent, these, and I think that poses the challenge for these institutions. They're doing a good job, but can they keep up with the scale of the change is the argument that I think we're trying to make. And so let me just quickly, I'm so glad Patrick said what he did, and he said it throughout the writing of this report. So the answer, Tony, is not that we've moved from one sort of liberal, one conservative model of austerity to a kind of almost, a sort of giving it away model where, the country gets whatever it wants because there's a sort of embarrassed World Bank and IMF staff who are so ashamed by the history of austerity that they now race to give it. It's Patrick's model of this deeply responsible partnership between the two sides, where you've moved from the old sort of donor model of giving to a cooperative model of shared partnership in this institution, where you're doing nobody any favors to borrow recklessly against a bad plan, because it leaves you as a country in debt and it leaves the institution stretched by having another debt problem. So, what we hope, and I think having one of us, the three of us, being a former prime minister in Africa, really helps us say that. This is about a new partnership. It's not just the tired old country ownership, blah, blah, blah. It's, of course, it sounds good. It's really trying to sort of have that relationship in a way that has not existed before. I think, in terms of who carries this forward, there are, I think Mark Carney made his bid to lead these kinds of coalitions last week. And you heard of Antonio Patriota, the Brazilian ambassador here. Well, Brazil is another, very big would-be leader of this kind of change. It's pushing for UN charter renewal. It's led the COP. It led the G20 a couple of years back. So, so, there are countries who are keen to sort of grab the stick on this and move forward reform. And then, John, I do want to say a word about the governance issue, because, I actually at UNDP, when I led it, the most controversial, but I hope innovative thing I did was create a democratic governance practice. And, it was much criticized by some countries, but became an established part of the UNDP offering. The difficulty is, though, that whether it is UNDP doing it or the World Bank making governance conditionality around its loans, it has become tied up with a Western strategic or a perceived Western strategic vision of remaking countries in their own image. And, we've seen the shallow consequence that can have of a lot of countries, frankly, the majority of those I have in mind, in fact, in Africa, who go through token elections. Because for a while that was the conditionality. And yet, were the elections in Uganda or Tanzania or Cameroon free? And so, I think governance, as Patrick argued, and as Sri Mulyani and Indonesia have shown, has to come from inside. But the fact is, if you don't have it, you don't develop. I mean, and that's the key thing, because, we wrote a report about the World Bank and IMF, but we actually found that the critical conditions which secure development are not the health of those two institutions. They are the quality of leadership in countries. And, that is what has to go on improving. Because, as we've all said from this platform, we've come off 25 years of the most successful development in human history in terms of the number of people lived out of poverty, but we've really fallen off the cliff now in terms of, all those numbers stalling. And so, we've got to make it clear that while finance matters, as both my co-authors have all argued, the key is governance and sound policy at the country level. And I think that's where the development debate is going to move. And it's going to mean that countries sometimes do some uncomfortable things that the Western European consensus doesn't like. Oil and gas in Mozambique, is possibly one, because that's the world we're moving into, where I think these choices will be made at the country level, not at the international fora level. Let me just, if I may, in closing, acknowledge two colleagues who really helped us with this, Jonathan Glennie there, and Stephen, I mentioned you earlier, and took a punch at the Americans on the way, but Stephen Paduano, who is now at Oxford, who was incredibly helpful, both of them on this, and there are several others online. So thank you to you all as well.
But thank you to you, Sri Muliani and Patrick, for the report, and Minouche for being with us to commenting. I think the report is an incredible contribution to the debate. And it's interesting you quote Gramsci. I mean, being Italian born and raised, you can imagine how many times those writings have come back to mind. I've been increasingly quoting them since the pandemic, actually, hoping that things would, start to change and improve. But if there is something that I always remind myself in thinking about what Gramsci was writing, back in 38, 39, is that he also talked a lot about the optimism of the will and really inciting and encouraging people to come together to change things, to create coalitions that could, in a way, stem the challenge and the scourge of fascism that Italy had to endure. And so I think that this moment really does call for people to come together and create coalitions that can try and help us against the news that we read every day and the very destabilizing forces that we are enduring. With that, thank you so much. For those who are here, we can carry on a conversation over there with some nibbles and drinks. And for the online audience, thank you very much for being with us. And please join me in thanking our panel very much.